A faint distress signal. No one heard it except Morgan Tate. While her co-workers laughed at her for playing with junk equipment, she was listening to something the entire rescue system missed. A mountain rescue team, 9 people trapped in a blizzard in the Bitterroot Range. But Morgan Tate isn't just a radar technician. She has a past. And tonight, that past will decide whether 9 strangers live or vanish in the storm. This is the story of a silent hero no one saw coming. Before we begin, where are you watching this from? And what's the most powerful story of redemption you've ever heard? Welcome to Grateful Stories, where tales of compassion and kindness are told. Let's uncover what really happened. Snow swept across the empty runway, dragging long veils of white across the frozen tarmac. The wind had a sharp, metallic bite that cut through even the thickest gloves. On the far side of the airfield, under the skeletal frame of a rusted maintenance hangar, Morgan Tate worked alone. Her jacket was faded and patched in places, the kind issued to ground crews decades ago. In her hands, a rag moved slowly over the curved metal of an auxiliary radar dome, rubbing away the frost that had settled overnight. The dome hadn't been in official use for years, but she treated it like it was still part of the heartbeat of the airfield. Behind her, voices echoed from the open doorway. 2 younger technicians leaned on the frame, watching her with amusement. "Keep polishing." "Tate," one of them called. "Maybe it'll start predicting the weather from the last century." The other laughed, a quick, sharp sound that carried in the cold air. Morgan didn't look up. She gave a small, polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, then turned back to the radar. It wasn't the first time she'd heard it, and it wouldn't be the last. In a place like Northwind Regional Airfield, where the winters were long and the flights sparse, gossip filled the silence. The quiet technician with the military posture made an easy target. Inside the hangar, warmth clung only in patches where heaters hummed weakly. Morgan kept to herself, eating her lunch in the far corner of the workshop, her back to the wall, eyes occasionally flicking toward the wide hangar doors. In front of her lay a weathered leather notebook, its pages filled with neat, compressed handwriting in small, precise diagrams. She never let anyone else read it. If asked, she'd say it was just notes on repair schedules, equipment logs, nothing important. But the way she handled it, closing the cover the moment someone walked by, told another story. That afternoon, the light from the high windows stretched in long amber lines across the concrete floor. Somewhere deeper in the hangar, a radio played low, static crackling between old country songs. Morgan sat with her coffee, steam curling up in the cold air, and for a brief moment, she let her mind drift. The sound of rotors came first. Not here. Not now, another place entirely. In the darkness behind her closed eyes, she was back in a cramped command trailer overseas, headset pressing tight against her ears. She could smell the faint tang of ozone from overheated electronics, hear the rapid clatter of keys as operators relayed coordinates. A voice came through strained, short of breath, almost drowned by the sound of gunfire. Her call sign then had been Spectre 3. On 3 separate screens, UAV feeds showed the same hell unfolding from different angles. Pinned down soldiers in a dry riverbed, thermals tracking hostile movement from 2 ridges at once. She had linked the feeds in her head faster than the system could process them, moved drones like pieces on a chessboard, bought the trap squad enough seconds to reach a medevac point. When the evac bird lifted off, she'd taken her first deep breath in hours. The memory fractured there, turning sharp. Another mission? Another time the feed going black in the middle of a scream, a cold, blunt silence filling the trailer, and her voice breaking as she reported the loss. Morgan opened her eyes. The coffee had gone cold in her hands. Outside, the wind rattled the steel siding of the hangar, shaking loose a small drift of snow from the roof. She pushed the memory down, letting her expression settle into the practiced calm she wore like a uniform. It was easier that way. People here didn't need to know who she had been. A shadow stretched across her table. Eli Ward stood there, the tall, broad-shouldered night manager whose hair had silvered early. He handed her a clipboard without a word. His gaze lingered for a beat, as if weighing whether to say something. Eli was one of the few who never joined in the teasing. He'd flown rescue helicopters once long enough to recognize the look in someone's eyes when they'd seen too much. "You're on the dome again tomorrow," he asked finally. Morgan nodded. He gave a short nod back and moved on, leaving her in the low hum of the hangar. The afternoon wore on. Engines coughed to life outside as a cargo plane prepared for departure. Technicians moved between tool racks, the clang of metal on metal punctuating the air. Then the base radio cut through the noise. A crisp official voice filled the hangar, clear even through the static. "Attention all units, Mountain Hawk Rescue Squadron is commencing cold weather training in the Bitterroot Range. Severe weather conditions developing. Maintain open channels for updates." Morgan's head tilted slightly at the name. The Bitterroots were no place to be casual about in winter. She glanced toward the radar dome outside, its surface now catching the last thin light of day. And for a moment, her expression tightened just enough for Eli to notice from across the room. By late afternoon, the wind had turned from sharp to punishing. It whipped across the airfield in long, ragged gusts, carrying sheets of snow that blurred the hangar doors. The temperature dropped so fast the metal on the tools felt like ice to the touch. Eli Ward appeared by Morgan's workstation, collar turned up against the cold. "Storm's closing in fast," he said, glancing at the wall clock. "If you want to get home before it hits, go now. I'll cover the rest of the shift." Morgan shook her head without looking up from the panel she was inspecting. She had been tracing a wiring issue in the auxiliary radar console, the same one most of the crew considered obsolete. The dim light over the workbench flickered each time the wind rattled the hangar walls. Outside, snow hissed against the siding like sand. A faint crackle bled into her headset, at first just static, the kind you learn to ignore. She adjusted a dial, half expecting it to vanish. Instead, the noise sharpened into ragged breathing, broken words, and a clipped series of numbers. Morgan froze, one hand still on the dial. The voice came again, straining against the interference. "Mayday team coordinates," before it fractured back into static. Her eyes narrowed, listening past the noise for the patterns only she seemed to hear. Zach Connolly strolled over, a coffee in hand, catching the tail end of the transmission. "What's that? Someone playing Soldier on a ham radio?" Brent Kessler leaned in, grinning. Probably just some trucker stuck on the wrong frequency. "Junk signal." Morgan didn't answer. The cadence in that voice, the clipped way the numbers came, she knew it. It echoed a moment burned into her memory. From a mission long ago when a team had called for help no one could send. Zach tapped the side of the console. "Seriously, Tate, you mess with that too much and you'll take down the weather feed. Let the military handle their own mess." Brent chuckled. "Yeah, don't go playing hero on a training exercise." Their laughter faded behind her as she set the headset down and stood. Snow was now blowing in through the partially open hangar door, dusting the concrete floor. Morgan crossed to the far end of the hangar, where a heavy steel door sat recessed into the wall. Faded stenciling above it read, "Radar Room 2, authorized personnel only." No one had stepped inside for years. The room's network had been shut down in favor of newer, centralized systems. To most, it was a storage closet for outdated gear. She keyed in the old code from memory and pushed the door open. The air inside was colder than the hangar, smelling faintly of dust and machine oil. Rows of consoles sat in darkness, their surfaces coated in a fine layer of frost. Morgan flipped on a single overhead lamp, its pale glow revealing the network's dormant state. Every switch was down, every indicator dark. The room seemed to hold its breath, far from the airfield. The storm had swallowed the Bitterroot Range whole. Whiteout conditions erased the horizon, making sky and ground indistinguishable. Somewhere inside that storm, the Mountain Hawk Rescue Squadron fought to stay alive. Their snowmobiles had stalled hours ago. Wind chill cut through their layers, stealing heat faster than they could move. The team's radio had gone dead when ice locked the antenna in place. They tried the GPS units next, but the signal was smothered under thick cloud cover and magnetic interference from the mountains. Their leader, Captain Rhodes, kept the group moving in tight formation, urging them to conserve energy. In the back of his mind, he knew the math hypothermia in under 4 hours. A burst of static on an emergency handheld made them stop. It was a last-ditch distress beacon, voice barely breaking through. They called into the void, hoping anyone was listening. Back at North Wind, Morgan slid into the chair at the main console in Radar Room 2. She adjusted the gain on the antique receiver, coaxing the signal into clarity. The voice from the storm came through again, faint but insistent. She jotted the fragments of coordinates onto a scrap of paper, already mapping the location in her head. Her fingers moved with the same deliberate speed she had once used in a combat operations center. Outside, the howl of the wind grew louder, like the storm was pressing against the building. In the main hangar, Zach and Brent went back to their idle chatter, unaware she was gone. They had written off the voice as irrelevant the moment it didn't match their shift's checklist. To them, the storm was just another Montana winter. Morgan knew better. The rhythm of that transmission wasn't random. It was a lifeline thrown into the dark, and right now, she was the only one holding it. She reached for the main power switch on the console. The old circuits hummed reluctantly, lights flickering across the boards. Ancient fans spun up, pushing out a breath of stale air. Her reflection stared back from the dark glass of the central display. Calm, steady, eyes locked forward. She adjusted her headset, feeling the weight settle against her ears. Outside the door, the hangar's noise was muffled now, replaced by the quiet urgency of the room. Another burst came through, clearer this time. Mountain Hawk. 9 personnel, low on supplies, followed by a long hiss of static. Morgan's pencil moved fast, translating broken data into a workable path. Somewhere deep in the range, those men and women were fighting the same enemy she had faced before, not a human opponent, but time, cold, and isolation. She could almost feel the sting of the wind on her own cheeks, hear the crunch of ice under boots. Every detail her mind filled in made her movements sharper. She closed the heavy door, the latch clicking into place. Then she locked it. No interruptions, no debates, no wasted seconds. One by one, she brought the dormant systems online. Screens lit up in uneven succession, casting the room in shifting bands of green and amber. The hum of the radar sweep was low but steady, like a heartbeat returning after too long is still. Morgan Tate was alone in the room, but not alone in the fight. Out there, the Mountain Hawks were counting on a signal to cut through the storm, and in here, she was already moving to answer. The room shuddered as another gust slammed against the hangar wall. Morgan sat at the console, fingers dancing over switches and toggles that hadn't been touched in years. The radar array outside groaned as its motors came alive, turning slowly into the wind. She patched into the old auxiliary network first. One by one, dormant links blinked to life: a weather station 20 miles east, a highway camera buried under ice, a seismograph still humming in an abandoned mining site. Each feed was a fragment, but together they began to sketch the edges of the storm. On her secondary monitor, she pulled up the drone control interface. It was a small civilian unit the airport used to check runway conditions. Now it would be her eyes inside a blizzard no human could survive. The first attempt to launch failed. The drone's battery warning lit red. Morgan ignored it, overriding the system's caution protocols. The small propellers whined against the howling wind, forcing the craft into the storm. A shadow filled the doorway behind her. Eli Ward leaned against the frame, his breath fogging in the cold air. He took in the glow of the screens, the headset pressed tight to her ears, and the way her eyes never left the displays. "What's going on?" he asked quietly. She didn't look at him. Emergency signal from the Bitterroots. 9 personnel, minimal gear. Eli's brows knit. That's not on any official channel. It came through here, Morgan said, and nobody else heard it. For a moment, Eli stood there, weighing something in his mind. Then he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. You need me to keep them out. Morgan gave a single nod. Eli locked the door and moved to stand by it, a silent barrier between her and the rest of the hangar. On the radar scope, green arcs swept through patches of interference. The storm had carved a dead zone across every satellite feed. But in the chaos, Morgan spotted thin slivers of clarity, narrow windows between cloud layers where a signal or image might slip through. She rerouted the drone's navigation to ride those gaps. The camera feed jittered, showing flashes of snow, blurred rock faces, and once, a half-buried trail marker. She made a mental note of every landmark, stitching them together into a map only she could see. Meanwhile, a rescue helicopter idled at a forward station just south of the Canadian border. The pilot's voice crackled faintly on an emergency relay. Low fuel, minimal visibility, awaiting coordinates. Morgan keyed in a private link and began drafting a path that would thread the chopper through the least dangerous pockets of air. The drone's feed sharpened for a moment, revealing a narrow gorge ahead. Morgan froze. She recognized the shape of those cliffs, the place she'd once seen in a training brief labeled Dead Man's Chute. If the Mountain Hawk team went through there, the walls of snow above them could come down with the slightest vibration. The path was a perfect kill zone, not by enemy fire, but by nature's weight. Her jaw tightened as she watched the GPS marker creeping toward it. Eli stepped closer, glancing at the monitor. They're heading straight into it, he said. I know, Morgan replied. We've got minutes. The storm roared harder, rattling the old console. For a few seconds, the drone feed dissolved into static. She cursed under her breath, recalibrating the signal boost from the mining site's seismograph. The picture snapped back, this time showing movement. Figures bent against the wind, trudging single file along the frozen path. Morgan counted heads 9. Her fingers flew over the controls, sending coordinates to the helicopter pilot. She adjusted for wind drift, recalculated altitude to slip under the worst turbulence. The chopper would have to skim dangerously close to the ridgeline, but it was their only shot. The radar began to pick up tremors along the cliff above the team, not large enough to register as a full slide yet. But to Morgan's trained eye, the pattern was unmistakable. The snowpack was unstable. Every step the rescue team took under that slope was a gamble, and the weight was shifting toward collapse. She leaned forward, headset pressed tighter, her breath steady but her pulse quickening. Another gust hit, harder than before, making the drone's camera swing wildly. For a heart-stopping second, the feed went black again. Morgan tapped the console, coaxing the connection back, each second feeling longer than the last. When the image returned, she saw it clearly. The upper layer of snow had cracked. A fracture line jagged across the ridge, like a wound in the mountain's skin. It wouldn't take long before gravity claimed it. Eli's eyes flicked from the screen to Morgan's face. That's about to go, he said. Morgan didn't answer. Her mind was already running through options, none of them good. The rescue team was seconds from stepping directly beneath the weakest section. If she didn't act now, the storm wouldn't be the thing that killed them. She reached for the drone's flight stick, every movement deliberate. The craft was still miles from their position, but its presence could trigger what she needed. If she timed it perfectly, she could bring the snow down early before the team entered the chute. The radar beeped sharply, marking the shift in the snow mass. She adjusted the drone's heading, pushing it through another narrow gap in the storm. Outside, the wind screamed against the hangar walls, as if trying to drown out the urgency building in the room. Eli watched in silence now, understanding that whatever she was about to do, it wasn't in any manual. On the monitor, the jagged fracture above the team widened another inch. Morgan's hands tightened on the controls. The decision was made. In her ear, the faint voice of the rescue pilot broke through. We're holding. Say the word. Morgan's eyes stayed locked on the screen. She saw the ridge, the snow, the fragile line between survival and burial, and she knew this was the moment to tip the balance. The next move would decide if 9 people walked out alive. The fracture line above the gorge widened another inch, snow shifting in slow motion against the gray sky. Morgan's eyes stayed locked on the monitor, her fingers gripping the drone's controls with surgical precision. She'd measured the angles, the timing, the distance, but she knew there would be no second try. Eli stepped closer, tension clear in his voice. "If you're off by a few seconds, you'll bury them." Morgan didn't glance up, or, she said evenly, "I wait, and they die under it anyway." The room went silent except for the hum of the old radar. She pushed the drone higher, cutting into a stream of wind that made its small frame shudder violently. Every alert on the interface screamed warnings: battery low, turbulence critical, collision risk high. She silenced them with a single keystroke. The view from the drone pitched wildly as it cleared the ridge. Below, the rescue team was still a minute away from the mouth of the chute, unaware of what hung above them. The crack in the snowpack gleamed faintly in the light filtering through the storm. Morgan exhaled slowly, thumb hovering over the throttle. Her mind calculated the impact point, the exact place where a shockwave would bring the slope down before the team stepped into the kill zone. She committed. "Hold on," she murmured. Not to Eli, not even to the pilot, just to herself. The drone's motors screamed as she sent it into a steep dive toward the ridge. Wind tore across the camera feed, reducing the image to flashes of white and jagged rock. Eli's hand gripped the back of her chair. "Tell me you're sure about this," he said. Her answer was calm, almost detached. "I'm sure enough to do it." The craft slammed into the cliff face just above the fracture line. The sound came through the mic as a dull, hollow crack, followed by a deep, rolling roar. Snow shuddered, then broke free in a single massive sheet from the drone's dying feed. Morgan caught the start of the avalanche, an ocean of white collapsing in on itself, rushing down with terrifying speed. The image froze mid-frame, then went black. Signal lost. On the radar, she watched the movement of the snow mass as it poured into the chute, filling it completely. The slide ended seconds before the rescue team reached the spot, leaving a wide, packed bed of snow behind. It was dangerous terrain, but now it was stable enough for a landing. Morgan switched channels, her voice steady as she keyed into the auxiliary frequency. "Northwind actual to inbound Hawk flight target zone clear. Approach from 242 degrees. Altitude 1500. There was a pause. Then the pilot's voice came back, clipped in professional copy on your approaching. No one on that frequency asked who she was. They didn't have time to care. All that mattered was that someone was guiding them through the storm. On her monitor, the helicopter's thermal signature crept toward the landing zone. Morgan adjusted their path twice, threading them between downdrafts that could flip them sideways. Eli stood beside her, watching without a word. The chopper flared hard, its skids kissing down on the fresh avalanche bed. Rescuers spilled out, their figures bright against the white as they ran to the cluster of shapes huddled together in the snow. Even from the grainy thermal image, Morgan could see the exhaustion in their movements. One by one, they were pulled toward the aircraft. Some stumbled under their own weight. Others were half carried. Frost clung to their hoods and beards, faces flushed raw from the wind. The helicopter lifted off, rotors sending a spray of snow outward like a halo. Morgan tracked it on radar until it cleared the mountains and angled south toward the forward station. Her hand stayed on the controls until its signal faded from the scope. Only then did she lean back in her chair. The console lights reflected faintly in her eyes, but her gaze was distant. The headset hung loosely around her neck, the faint hiss of static filling the room. Eli broke the silence. "You just burned the only drone we've got." Morgan's lips curved into the ghost of a smile. It bought them a landing zone. Her tone carried no pride, just fact. The room seemed colder now, the hum of the equipment fading as systems wound down. She began powering each console off, one by one, until the last screen went dark. The radar sweep slowed to a stop, leaving the room in shadow. In the dim light, she rested her hands on the table. Only then did she notice the faint tremor in her fingers. She curled them into fists until it passed. Outside, the storm still raged against the hangar walls, oblivious to what had just happened. Somewhere above the Bitterroots, a helicopter carried 9 people who would see the sunrise. Inside radar room 2, Morgan sat in silence. The faint hum of cooling metal the only sound left. The storm passed in the night, leaving the airfield buried under a fresh, silent layer of snow. By morning, the official report was already circulating, just a single paragraph, noting that the Mountain Hawk Rescue Squadron had narrowly escaped an avalanche during training. The cause was chalked up to fortunate timing. There was no mention of Radar Room 2, no acknowledgement of a voice on an auxiliary channel guiding a helicopter through a blind approach. Certainly no reference to a drone that would never return. In the hangar, life returned to its routine hum. Zach and Brent were back at their workstations, sipping coffee and trading stories. But when Morgan walked past, neither had a joke ready. Their eyes followed her for a moment longer than usual. Not suspicious, just different. Like something had shifted without them knowing why. She went about her tasks the same as always, checking connections, logging maintenance notes in her worn leather book. If she noticed the change in their tone, she gave no sign. Her pace never faltered. Late that evening, Eli stopped by Radar Room 2 before heading out. The lights were off, the consoles powered down. In the trash bin beside the desk, something caught his eye, a shard of carbon fiber with the faint curve of a drone's wing. He reached in, brushing off a thin dusting of snow that had clung to it. The leading edge was splintered, the paint scuffed from impact. Eli turned it in his hands, a knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. He didn't say a word to anyone. Some things were better kept quiet. Instead, he slid the broken piece into his jacket pocket and walked out into the cold. A week later, Morgan opened her toolbox to find a strip of white tape stuck to the inside lid. The handwriting was hers, though she couldn't remember putting it there. It read, "Don't just find your way out, make a way for someone else." She paused for a moment, fingertips resting on the tape. The hangar was alive with the clang of tools and the distant rumble of a taxiing plane. Outside, the peaks of the Bitterroot Range rose sharp against a pale winter sky. From here, she could just make out the ridge where the avalanche had fallen. The snowfield was still scarred, a frozen reminder of the choice she'd made. She watched it for a long time before turning back to her work. The cloth in her hand moved over the curve of the old auxiliary radar dome, the same way it had every morning. Slow, methodical, the motion as familiar as breathing. The metal caught the light from the high windows, a dull gleam in the quiet afternoon. No one asked her about that night. She didn't offer an explanation. Whatever stories were whispered about what happened in the storm, she left them to grow on their own. By the end of the month, the drone inventory still listed 1 unit as out of service. Radar Room 2 remained locked, its key hanging on the same hook as always. To anyone else, it was just an empty space. But Eli noticed that whenever a certain kind of static whispered through the radio room, Morgan's posture changed. Her head tilted, listening, measuring, and if the signal lingered long enough, she would quietly set down her tools and walk toward the steel door. Once, as she passed, Eli caught her eye. Neither spoke, but he gave a small nod. She returned it before disappearing inside. The lock clicked shut behind her, sealing away whatever work she intended to do. From the outside, there was no sound, just the faintest hum of power, barely audible over the hangar's noise. Minutes or hours later, she'd emerge again. Expression unreadable. If one day, a stray signal bled into an old auxiliary channel, and Morgan Tate walked into Radar Room 2, it meant something simple. Somewhere out there, someone had just been given a second chance, and that was reason enough for her to act.